Well, look, I'm grateful to be with you again. It's always a pleasure to be among so many individuals who are so committed to creating communities in which we all flourish together in faith and in life. And I just scan the room. I see preachers and practitioners and allies and advocates. I see a few instigators, and so I feel at home in this crowd, certainly. I was asked to speak about where we are and where we might go next at this intersection of congregational ministry and disability, and to highlight what I see as some of the most pressing questions in this area of our collective work. And if I understand that charge correctly, really what I'm trying to do is to spark some conversations among all of you, ones that will continue throughout today, throughout this institute, and that you'll take back with you as you leave this place, that would really push our field further and farther and faster. And so I want to provide just a little context for what I'll share. My own work really focuses on young people with developmental disabilities, people we often know by labels like Down syndrome and intellectual disability or autism or multiple disabilities. These are individuals who so often are not seen as having gifts and faith and friendship that make them indispensable within the church. And I also spend my time trying to move the local church in ways that positions them to see it as essential that we all worship and fellowship and learn and serve alongside one another. So it's in this space that I really want to highlight what I see as 5 pressing questions. And for each of these questions to offer some areas where I see some encouraging movements and also some areas of some concern. Now, some of you know I have been crisscrossing the country this year in a motorhome with my 5 members of my family as a part of a year-long sabbatical. And so this metaphor of a journey is kind of fresh on my mind. There are a few other metaphors that come out of spending lots of time in close quarters, but those are not so appropriate for this gathering. So I frame these questions within this context of kind of a journey, and I'll walk through each of them in just a moment. First is, how do we get from here to there? What are the pathways that we take us from where we are now in congregations across the country to where we really are called to be? Which of course begs the second question, what do we even mean by there? How will we know we've arrived? And really, what are the markers of congregational ministry that is flourishing and faithful in this area? And third, why is a different destination so essential for us to pursue? What difference does it make for a community when we adopt different ways of gathering and relating? And fourth, what does here look like right now? What is our starting point right now? What are the prevailing models of ministry all across this country? And what do we think about them? And fifth, how do we launch this journey? What are the catalysts that are really needed to spur congregations to take that first next step? So what I'm going to do is elaborate on each of these just a bit, highlight some key questions and encouraging points and some concerns. And I'm going to take them slightly out of order here. First question, where are we now? What's the current landscape when it comes to congregational ministry and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities? What does here look like at the present time for us? And I think for many of us, you think maybe this question is really already settled in your mind, at least for this audience, because many of you are here because you see deep and pressing needs right in your midst. You see calls unfulfilled. You see responses that have been less than stellar. You see sanctuaries that are not places of sanctuary. And you really see a there that is quite different than where we are right now. But we know surprisingly little actually about how congregations are moving nationally or all around the world. We don't know a lot about the models of ministry that they're adopting and the reasons that they do so, about the extent to which people with disabilities and their families are being welcomed or leaving wounded, are being invited or being uninvited, are being the ones who are the focus of service or the ones doing service, as we heard earlier. And I think this is a space where anecdotes abound far much more than compelling data. So I think a fuller question to this answer of where we are now would really help bolster the calls that we're making to make meaningful movements within and across denominations. I think it could help us identify some trends, some that are concerning and some that are encouraging. It could reveal areas of excellence that we might want to have as models or motivation for others. And I think it could spur much needed reflection on our current practices and our postures, and ultimately position us to gauge whether the investments we're all making here are really making a difference at the level of practice. My sense is we've done far too little study of where we are now. Well, my own research has suggested a very mixed portrait of here. I'm encouraged in many areas by the growing number of congregations that are launching intentional efforts related to disability, and by the growing awareness within the church and also within broader society about a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here over the years of the Institute. And I'm encouraged by some of the growth in the national organizations, those national ministries that are coming alongside congregations and helping them move forward in these areas. But let me highlight just a few concerns about where we are right now. First is that I think the dominant model of ministry still seems to be ministry apart from people with disabilities. It's either in the sense that people with disabilities are not part of congregational life at all, or that prevailing ministry approaches are specialized and separate. In other words, people with and without developmental disabilities more and more are attending the same faith community and less ever encountering each other when they're there. And my sense is this movement towards distinct and separate programming is actually accelerating rather than abating, and it's particularly in larger congregations. And second, the approaches being so widely advocated seem to really place their accent on starting new programs. And I talked about this last year, but on grouping people with like labels, and then rather than providing individualized supports to help people be part of all aspects of faith and community life. And I wonder if this really reflects some underlying view that people with developmental disabilities have special needs far more than they have universal needs, or maybe that belonging has to take a back seat to believing. And third, I think the investments of congregations still seem to be so limited in scope to 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night or whenever you gather. And while we should remain dogged about making sure that our worship services and our religious education programs and our youth programs are accessible, we forget that most of life is lived beyond the walls of our congregation. And the relationships are ultimately formed throughout the other 6 days of the week. And we have to be as concerned about what happens when people leave our congregational buildings as when they actually come and arrive. So as we look across a landscape of 300,000 churches and other places of worship across the country, where are we now? And will we stay settled here? Which of course leads to the second question, where ought we go? I can't tell you how many times I heard from the back seat of the motorhome one of my kids calling out, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" over and over. And I'm like thinking, look out the window, you would know when we're at the mountains, right? But as I think about that and the movements that we're making in congregations across the country, do we know where we're trying to go? And will we know when we've actually arrived? Because in so many of the formal gatherings that we have, I've noticed we spend a considerable amount of time really trying to pinpoint what's wrong with where we are now. And there's lots to talk about, right? Barriers of access and architecture and attitude and awareness, they seem to abound. But we're really quite good at critiquing where we are now, and yet we struggle, I think, to really articulate what it would look like if all was really going as it should. And can we paint a picture of a different future for congregations? Do we know what we're aiming for? Just think about the language, how the language of our pursuits has really changed over the years. We used to talk about mainstreaming, and then integration, and then inclusion, and then access, and now belonging. And I think each of those really addresses a different dimension of what it means to be present and to have a presence. So what type of community are we really striving to become? Is our goal to obtain a certain proportion of people in a particular place? Is it about a specific demographic mix that we're trying to attain? Is it just about creating access to activities or about the availability of supports? Is it all about hosting that new respite program or arranging a peer buddy system or developing a religious IEP or adding an interpreter to the second service? Are we striving to mirror the way inclusion is being defined in schools and workplaces and communities? Or are we reaching for something that's different, something more, something deeper? I doubt there's a single answer to that question of what there would look like. We're all going to have different responses based on our beliefs and the ways we gather. But I think compelling answers to this question really could give guidance to congregations that are really striving to catch hold of a vision for where they might go in this area. They really are struggling to put into practice this call that they're hearing, and they're looking for clear points of reference to reflect upon. You probably heard that old Yogi Berra quote, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there, right? Well, what do we really mean when we say we want congregations to be fully inclusive of people with disabilities and their families? Or a congregation to become a place of belonging? What are the things that mark the postures and the practices and the perspectives of that kind of faith community? Do we know what we would point to? Well, my concern is that faith communities, I think, are trailing rather than leading these conversations about inclusion. We seem to be readily kind of adopting the goals and the language and the approaches and the support models of educational and service systems and secular systems that surround us, rather than offering really richer alternatives and more compelling vision. And I think there's a lot we can learn from what we see in schools and from agencies and elsewhere, but I think there's a lot we also want to avoid replicating and importing into our churches. And at the same time, I'm really excited about some of the ideas that have been emerging here at the Institute. Over the years, there's been a noticeable shift in our emphasis as we push past inclusion and start talking about belonging. It's something last year I shared that my colleagues and I have been working on around understanding what belonging looks like in the lives of people with developmental disabilities and their families. And we've learned about what belonging might look like for anyone. To be invited, to be present, to be welcomed, to be known, to be accepted, to be supported and cared for, to be befriended, to be needed, and to be loved. And I wonder still what we're missing. And so with both starting points and destinations in our mind, the third question naturally emerges. How do we get from here to there? And this seems to be one of the most challenging questions that we face, because the terrain between these 2 points seems to be largely uncharted and the distance seems pretty great. And I think it's a question that's on the minds of so many congregations right now that are ready to respond to this call. They are beginning to affirm the theologies that we're talking about at this institute. And the most common questions that I hear are not questions about why, but questions about how we proceed. Where do we begin? What movement should we make? How do we proceed? What is this going to demand of us? And congregations find they're either in this place of utter uncertainty or they're overwhelmed by the options that they encounter. So how do congregations get from where they are now to this new vision of their community? What's the place of reflection and prayer and planning and partnerships that move them to these new postures and positions? Well, one view is that we can tinker our way to there, that through kind of careful tweaking of practices or the layering in of additional supports or the retrofitting of our facilities, we're going to find ourselves in a place where belonging and inclusion and reciprocity abound. And that seems to be where most congregations are pursuing. And I wonder what you think of that. A contrasting view is that we ought to rethink how we gather all together, in a sense to start from scratch or at least to back up considerably. That from the very outset, congregations need to design and plan what they do with all of their community in mind and move people from an afterthought to a forethought. And here, as we kind of do that reflection, what we realize is our barriers to belonging are not surface, they're really structural. I've not seen a lot of examples of that first approach actually leading all the way there. And I've seen few examples of this latter approach being undertaken. Well, I'm encouraged by the growing number of reflection approaches that are now available to congregations, processes that point them more toward a series of landmarks to look at rather than very prescribed practices. In other words, a shift away from boxes to check on an accessibility survey and really towards postures that can be adopted in a congregation and aligned with the culture and commitments they have. And I'm encouraged by the growing number of congregations that are saying, this is a journey we want to pursue, but help us, come alongside us, encourage us. And I suppose my concern here is that we're not telling enough stories of how congregations are traveling from here to there successfully, of what it looks like to take this journey over time and how to navigate the roadblocks and the detours and the disappointments and the breakdowns that inevitably happen. And instead, we offer congregations a critique of here, where they are without offering alternatives. We give them a vision of there, and we don't give them directions. And people need examples to emulate and to be encouraged by. And fourth, why ought we pursue this journey? Why is it essential for congregations to take this particular journey, that they move from here to there in this of all the areas in which they're feeling called or pulled? Clergy will tell you they are approached all the time with multiple directions that people say they ought to be pursuing. Seminaries will say there are already so many competing demands in their crowded curriculum. Ministry leaders will list off all the other pressing needs that they find in front of them. And so responding to issues around disability tend not to rise to priority levels, and that referral really becomes the default ministry option for so many congregations. So can we sharpen our case for why this call is so critical, and then share it in ways and in places that will resonate with individuals who are not familiar with disability, but who are in positions of influence within their congregations and denominations? And that means moving the conversation beyond this present company and out of our journal articles and out of our academic books and into new places. I suppose my concerns in this area are that we probably have a much bigger story to tell about why all of this matters. So many times in conversations about inclusion and why it's important, we talk about why such movements are good for the person who's being included, for the person who is a stranger or an outsider. And indeed, most research in this area is framed around why inclusion is good for people with disabilities. And it turns out it is, substantially. But that individual storyline is not really moving the landscape in any way, or in substantial ways. The full story we have to address is how is the community strengthened by the presence and the participation and the gifts of everyone? Can we speak specifically about how entire communities might be strengthened by the presence and participation of people with disabilities? And what makes those individuals really indispensable to the thriving of that community? And the final question, which my timekeeper will be happy with. How do we spur more movement? We have to move past more proclamations and positions. We have to move past writing more resolutions and issuing formal statements. But what is the required catalyst for starting new movements within congregations? What are the things among congregations that are a little further along that was the spark for them that really pushed them forward? You might think that it begins with whoever is in the pulpit, but rarely does this actually happen. I mean, not all clergy see this as a priority. Few feel prepared to lead in this direction. It's largely untouched in seminaries, with a few exceptions represented here. And instead, we see families as the impetus. Parents who raise questions about what their church could do to move from exclusion to embrace, and then they are promptly asked or expected to be the ones who actually do something about it. So there are opportunities all over around this question for national ministries to work in much more collaborative and clever ways with one another to make sure this call is amplified and that congregations have support for individuals from birth all the way up through retirement and beyond. But what would that look like for ministries to work in new ways together? There are opportunities for seminaries to fully equip their graduates with a vision for and a commitment to serving all of their community. But what would it look like for this to happen? And there are opportunities for the emergence of more local faith community networks to extend invitations and encouragement and to come alongside congregations in the area who are willing to take this journey. But what would it take to really spur more of those networks? There's opportunities for service systems to see themselves as allies and partners in this work, and to see supporting a life of faith as essential to supporting flourishing. But what would it look like to really spur that? And there are opportunities for more individuals with intellectual disability to be raised up and to be equipped and supported as leaders in this movement. And what would it look like to make that happen? So there you have it. 5 questions to consider for those of us who are really striving to make movements in congregations all across this country. Where are we now? Where ought we go? How do we get from here to there? Why ought we pursue this journey? And how do we spur more movement so that more and more communities can experience the completeness of being a place where everyone is welcomed and everyone believes and everyone belongs? So I'm excited to continue that conversation with each of you and to hear your answers throughout this week. And thank you for your time.